Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Books of the World, a project of the Cape Cod Writer Center. I'm Paul Reynolds, and joining us today is Edmund Wedge, who's here to discuss the first novel of his multi-book space action sci-fi saga, Ocean Black, The Noble Exiles. Edmund, thank you for joining us today on the program.
Thanks for coming, buddy.
Now, The Noble Exiles takes place roughly 300 years in the future, after the cataclysmic and mysterious destruction of Earth, and follows a fledgling humanity to its new colony among the stars. What were some of your literary inspirations in writing this piece?
I mean, when I first did the project, right? Because I know we're going to talk a little bit about the size of it. I'm going through all my old work. I had written probably at least 3 sort of semi-complete novels that I never released or published or shopped around or anything. I did them for me. And they sort of represented different eras in my life as well as sort of different influences, right? So, you had the stuff that was very much driven by, all the Star Wars books I read as I was a kid. I had Isaac Asimov was a huge influence on me. I absolutely love the Foundation series to death. When they refer to that era of science fiction writing as the golden age of science fiction, I take that seriously. I really think that. So I love the Foundation series. I still reread it even now. And so I had that as an inspiration. I had all the Star Wars books I read. I was reading Tom Clancy when I was a kid too. So I had work that was in that vein that was very, not really science fiction-y at all. Very political thriller, very political mystery type of stuff, and dramatic in that sense. So I had all these stories that I had written based on these different influences, and I said, well, I want to write something epic. Let's go through my old stuff and figure out what really makes me, what really tickles me, and what are some of the best characters. What's my own highlight reel, and how can I sort of take that and build something great that I'd be proud of to produce as a body of work. So. Yeah, I would say there's a bunch of different influences from those old stories that I wrote that were inspired by, the golden age science fiction, looking at Asimov stuff. Dune, of course, was a big one. Game of Thrones is number one, obviously a lot more recent. That's neither sci-fi nor political thriller. Well, it's Game of Thrones. It's political.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of politics.
Yeah, I would say there's a fair amount of politics in Game of
Absolutely.
Thrones. So, you get that as different inspirations, but it was a lot because it was all these different stories that I cherry-picked from, and there were characters that are in this book that you've told me about one of them who you really like. That character is from a novel that I wrote, good Lord, close to 12 to 13 years ago, right? And the character was in that book, and I sort of reimagined her in this series, right? And kind of, again, borrowing from those old stories and those old inspirations to try to build something new.
And the piece is certainly thematically very rich with, like you mentioned, political intrigue, elements of alien technology, historical commentary, and some good old-fashioned sword and shield combat.
Right.
Who exactly is your target reader?
Not my favorite question, right? I'm bad at the marketing aspect of this, certainly. When I think about it, usually I think about, when I try to think about who it's for, I hope there's something for everybody because of that diversity of sources of inspirations. On the science fiction-y side, especially in the long view, right? The type of people who get into a series and they want to see those characters change over years or generations even, right? You get these science fiction stories out there that are almost generational in their breadth. And then in terms of sort of the nuanced stuff, sort of the narrow view, and not to say narrow view it's a bad thing, that you get these types of things where, concentrating on the individual lives of particular characters, they go through the mess of daily life, right? Captain Mind's, crew of, there's no good word that I can use to describe them. They're a bunch of pirates, right? I mean, basically, and sort of the jokes and the silliness and all the dependent things that go on with them living their lives in this universe. So I would say that there is definitely something for everyone, from an audience perspective.
So there are aspects for the younger reader who's enjoying the Star Wars novels that
Sure.
shaped your younger interpretation,
Sure.
and there's something for the older, or maybe more read reader
Absolutely.
with Asimov and inspirations like
Yeah.
Dune or Game of Thrones. So
Yeah, you definitely have to be, in this day and age anyway, you have to be considered well-read to know Asimov, I feel like. I feel like I'm dating myself saying that I used to read Asimov, but it was really, he was writing the Foundation series well before my time, so, but anyway.
now you've mentioned in the past that Ocean Black was intended to be a multi-book series from the very outset. What was it like to undertake a project that you knew from the outset was going to have a large size and scope?
Yeah, that was the super intimidating part about it, and like I said, and this, it sounds cool when you say it, like, oh, I pulled inspiration from all these different stories, but when you do that, what you're really volunteering for is a pretty significant undertaking, right? Because the more source material you have, right, the bigger your sort of end game becomes. And definitely as I sort of built that first draft of what I thought was going to be the first book, and I built the book after it, right? Because I'm thinking, well, this will be 2 or 3 books, and it'll be little pieces, and it'll be different stories, and it'll be great. And I did that, and I wrote those drafts, and then I looked at it, and I sort of said to myself, well, you know, it's great and all, but I felt like the reader wouldn't appreciate the nature of the characters, or wouldn't understand them the way I understood them, right? Because they wouldn't know their histories, they wouldn't know where they came from, they wouldn't know what had happened to them or influenced them by the time they got to that point. Because in terms of what the undertaking was, right, it was to basically write a history from, you know, 2050, 300 years forward, right? I wrote that entire history, and it's in spreadsheets and documents, and I must have written hundreds of pages of notes on this over the course of 3 or 4 years. So it was a pretty significant undertaking, and I did all that. And so you have those couple of drafts, right? And then you say, well, you know, they won't understand these characters as well, so why don't I go back a little bit into the historical timeline and pick another point to do that book, right? And that's what Noble Exiles is. And you could argue that I maybe went back a little bit too far, because now I'm looking at writing 7, 8, 9 books like it's no big deal. But I'm going to do it, and I'll tell you why. Even though I felt at first, as I started on the Noble Exiles, maybe I went back too far in the proverbial, you know, in the timeline, right, to start this project. Having written it now, working on the second book, I'm halfway through that. And I loved writing this book, and I'm loving writing the second one right now. The feeling that I'm getting from that and how that's going has totally validated my approach. So that even though it's taken me 3 or 4 years to get to this point, and even though I'm sort of, you know, doing the churn now in the next book, when you take on a project like this, you start to appreciate the value of just taking it off in little bites, right, and chewing through it every single month, every single week, every single day. And then all of a sudden you get to the point where you're like, oh, wow, I have 5 books ahead of me mapped out. I've already done one. The second one's on the way. Right? And it kind of takes on a momentum of its own. And being able to plan something with that, you know, where I am in my life, to plan something that far out, to say, 5 years from now, I want to write this book, this book, this book, this book, right? And to sort of chew through that year after year, and to be able to look back behind you and see the progress that you've made. It's been, I'm super encouraged by it. I'm so happy with how it's gone, and like I said, I really feel like it sort of validated the approach that I took, because definitely at the beginning it was a lot.
The feeling of the good news is I know exactly what I want to say. The bad news is it's going to take a couple thousand pages to say it.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And again, right, I thought originally this book would be like a larger, maybe 800 to 1,000 pages. And then I start to go write it, and I'm like, no, that's not a good idea. Your first book should not be 1,000 pages. You'll never get it done. So chop it into manageable pieces, right? So this is a story that, even though I'm, you know, telegraphing to you and to the audience obviously, right, that this is a large series, right? Each book stands on its own. Each book is its own story, right? There's its own character arcs, its own stuff going on. It's part of a larger whole, but it's its own story that is valid unto itself.
Now, the individual groups and cultures in Ocean Black seem incredibly nuanced.
Sure.
Now, your academic background is in world history. How did your knowledge of past cultures influence your vision for future ones?
In the sense that those other cultures, that I took specific traits from different cultures and kind of rolled that up into this sort of reimagining of humanity, right, among the stars. There was definitely some cherry picking there, but kind of stepping back from that for a moment, what I would say is that I think the biggest thing that influenced me from an academic perspective is the sense that national identity, not even national identity, just the nature of culture itself and how a culture becomes what it is and assimilates or builds the monikers and the symbols and the traditions and the displays of
the trappings
culture.
of civilization.
Exactly, whatever, right? We call it, like, I can't remember what they said in school, whatever the 6 things that constitute civilization when we were in high school. I'm sure the rules have changed since then. But it's the idea that over time, the academic view is that, in my mind, is that over time, no matter what, as culture changes, there's so much choice and so much, and it seems to us as historians sometimes to be almost arbitrary, but there's so much choice and so much, depending on what culture you're talking about, it's almost like a cultural amnesia in sort of the things that you choose to bring with you and choose not to bring with you, right? So it was very interesting to me to sort of apply that to this series and to my writing, right, is the concept that a particular culture might have given traditions or rituals or these different types of things, and then over the course of a period of time, they either willfully choose to just forget those things, they're gone, oh well, we're never going to talk about them or speak about them again, or in the total inverse to say, oh, those things are really important to us and we're going to carry those with us for 1,000 years, right? To me, it's so interesting to think about that a certain culture will, by its very nature, consider itself to be a culture that doesn't forget or has a long memory of these types of things. And other cultures that have a memory that's so short, it's like they can't remember what they ate for lunch. It's a poor metaphor, but I think certainly be analogous to a country, like our own country, like in the United States, for all the hand-wringing about history being important. I think it's the fundamental nature of the United States and the nature of the new world that we're putting the past behind us, right? We're not interested in all the old world. We're not interested in Europe. This is the new world, right? And we're gonna start from scratch over here. So that's a philosophical thing that separates, at least, again, as an example, the American culture from other cultures, from other philosophies.
History being written by the victors and having a tendency to support the narrative of
Sure.
the victor.
Sure.
Now, was there any historical figure or figures who influenced you more than others?
This actually goes in with the bit about America itself. Actually, when you think about the founding of the United States, right, and you think about how they imagined themselves in the New World. Well, yeah, they wanted to start over in the New World, but at the same time, the founding fathers, what did they cloak themselves in, right? There's Latin mottos on the currency, right? It's Roman architecture. It's all the trappings of, to use your word there, of this sort of Roman cultural dynasty that has come down to us as Americans, and we are the inheritors of that, of the Senate and people of Rome, right? That's why it's called the Senate. It's not an accident that we call it the Senate, right? It's named after something. So we've absorbed this, and we take it for granted, so much so that no one talks about it or thinks about it. And it's interesting to me because I consider America to be a culture that forgets. And when you think about a particular character that sort of America would have looked to, right, as being somebody that would be an influence, or was an influence for me as I thought of it, when Marcus Aurelius writes in his commentaries, he's one of the Roman emperors, he was alive in 150, 170 AD, something like that, and he's writing his commentaries, which are carried by our own General Mattis around with him. He writes that, in his own time, Augustus had been forgotten. Augustus Caesar is Marcus Aurelius's heir by about 100 years or something like that, but he was the first emperor, right? He defeats Mark Antony, he unites Rome after the Civil War. He literally creates the Roman Empire as we understand it. 100 years after him, people have already forgotten about him in the Roman Empire. It'd be like people forgetting about Abraham Lincoln. It's just the idea that even in the context of the Roman Empire itself, you could forget about somebody that important. That cultural amnesia like that could be such a function of a society. Thinking about that, thinking about Marcus Aurelius' reflection on that, was a huge influence to me, and it made a big deal to me as I went and wrote this, because I thought about, well, people always think about in the future, what will culturalists remember, what will be important to them as we go forward 100 years, 200 years, 300 years from now. And I tried to pose the question to myself at every opportunity as I crafted these unique worlds and these planets and these different types of things. I tried to ask myself, well, what are they going to forget? What aren't they going to know? Right? Because the other quote, I know I'm going to misquote him here, so I'll just paraphrase. The loss of the Library of Alexandria. I can't remember who writes it, but they wrote the destruction of the Library of Alexandria shows that no matter what we do, everything we gather will be lost. And so it's the idea again, right, that no matter how hard we try, we're going to forget things, that there's a cultural amnesia that just no matter what you do, you're going to forget things, and as a consequence, you're going to change, and you're going to be different no matter how hard you try.
In many ways, it's a tale of the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right, absolutely.
Now, along with some of these recurring themes throughout societies that make their way into our fiction, in Ocean Black, struggles with things like racism and classism seem to have found their way to follow humanity beyond the stars.
Sure.
What is it about the ubiquitous nature of these old prejudices that made you feel that they would figure into the novel?
Sure. So when we think about the context of the larger history, right? Because I know I said that I wrote a 300-year history, or this madness that I would engage in with spreadsheets and all that. One of the defining sort of beginning of that history, right, is that apocalypse, that destruction of Earth, and people flee, and the people who have the means to flee, whether it's fleeing from the current refugee crisis or whether it's in any situation, right, it's the people who have the means to flee. Now, leaving Earth is going to be a little bit more of an undertaking than leaving a given place on Earth for another place on Earth. Leaving Earth is going to be a pretty significant undertaking, and I can't help but see that, and I kind of already see this sort of setup happening in the culture today, is that the very wealthy and the well-connected and the elite are going to be the ones who leave, right? They're going to have the capacity to do that, and when they do that, they're going to, they're going to bring their material possessions with them, right? They're going to bring things. That's how they define themselves, right? It's through their wealth. We wouldn't know they were wealthy if they didn't have all this stuff. But that's not the only thing they bring with them, right? As a human being, you can't not also bring with you those intangibles, those cultural traits, right? And you're going to pick and choose what those things are. Again, cultural amnesia, right? And I can't help but see that no matter how hard they try, when the wealthy leave this planet, they're going to bring with them, the good stuff, I'm sure, but they're going to bring the bad stuff with them too, right? They're going to bring white supremacy with them. They're going to bring patriarchy with them. They're going to bring a stratified society with them. But when this, happens, right, no one has gone through the effort or done the work to solve those sort of high-level cultural problems. And as a consequence of not doing the work to solve those, right, inevitably, when it's time to go somewhere else, they're bringing that stuff with them because they don't know how to live. There's no other way for them to think about themselves. And that's what bothers me about the current culture, is that you get these guys like, with respect to them, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, these other guys who are all talking about, oh, we're going into space, we're going to Mars, right? It's going to be great. What could go wrong, right? We get there, we put up the colony, no harm, no foul. What could possibly go wrong? We're going to bring these problems with us. And if we don't solve them, all we're doing is we're spreading these problems, right? It's like a disease. Or what will it mean if we don't solve the questions of white supremacy or patriarchy, and we go to another planet with those things, and we implement those things in a society on another planet? It bothers me so much that in the present culture, people aren't thinking about that, right? They just think, well, if we do it, it'll sort itself out. Well, no, it won't. It won't sort itself out if you don't do the work, the cultural work, the necessary debates that have to happen between polities within a given culture or within a given society to do the work to resolve those questions. Because otherwise, you're just gonna take that hierarchy and move it somewhere else. That's not a good look.
Now, you mentioned the study of Jewish eschatology playing into part of the foundation of the novel. Could you
Yeah.
elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't want to get super into it because I will spoil the ending. The general idea here, when we talk about, I know we keep talking about this in terms of cultural traits, cultural amnesia, the idea of cherry picking, so to speak, of what we're going to take with us and not take with us. We're comparing and contrasting different cultures that do that and don't do that. So, you can have a particular culture that maybe chooses a couple things to bring with them, but they leave everything behind. With respect, the Hebrews, the people of Israel, right? When they go somewhere, right? What do they bring with them? They bring everything. They bring their entire cultural memory with them. And for some cultures, forgetting things, putting things in the past, deciding that, oh, that doesn't matter, or oh, we're just going to pretend that whole Civil War thing never happened. That's one way of dealing with it. I would argue that the nation of Israel has taken somewhat of a different tack, right? They're going to remember everything, and without weighing in on whether that's good or bad, I think it's a good thing. Is the idea that that makes them sort of different in that sense, that we can differentiate that from those other cultures, and that to me that's valuable, because part of this book series is going to be sort of that contrast between the narrow view and the long view. And certainly in the book we try to almost unanimously refer to them as the Yehudim, right? I hope I'm saying that right. That's the Hebrew word for it, is the idea that they have the long view, right? And as we get through sort of the end of the series, that long view is going to be borne out. That this sort of horrific episode, even though it's apocalyptic, and everyone else views it as apocalyptic. Oh, it's the great demise. It's the end of the world. We're all doomed, right? The Yehudim perspective is that no, well, yeah, sure, it might be the end, but this is just another Exodus, right? We've been through this before. We remember being through this before, and we'll get through it. And that sort of rugged optimism. That's not necessarily the appropriate thing to say at all, but that idea of hope and moving forward despite all odds. That's a huge thing, and I view that to be so important to the character of the series. And again, I know that's a lot to say, but that's not all I would want to say on it. But again, with the interest of being respect to how the series is going to go, I don't want to say more than that.
Sure, of course. And now the title of the saga is Ocean Black.
Sure.
And there is significant nautical imagery throughout the piece.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit on what it was about the ocean that inspired you, and inspired you with its imagery, and what about life on Cape Cod in particular, if anything, played into that?
Yeah, and I am my earliest memory of my life is being at my grandfather's house, who I'm named after. He had a house in North Falmouth, and going down to the beach there and being on the beach as a kid. Being in the ocean, that is like my earliest, strongest memories of going down there and doing that. So I mean, that's the sort of the personal influence. And I've lived on, I live on Cape now, and I have for some time. But setting aside the personal side of things, why I chose to name it Ocean Black, what the inherent symbolism is, and the use of sort of the ongoing nautical metaphors, right? Is the idea that it's in the Lord's Prayer, right? Our Father who art in heaven, on earth as it is in heaven. It's on the back of the book, and the idea that on earth, when it was the age of discovery, right, and how the entire world was explored, was in the age of sail, right, in the age of discovery. Well, what did they use to do that? They, built a bunch of wooden rafts, and they hoisted up some giant cloth sails, right, and they let the wind and water take them where they would, right? They didn't have diesel engines, they didn't have, electricity, right? It was the currents of the ocean, of the planet itself, that guided them to where they needed to be, right? The planet did most of the work for them, right? So I apply that concept to space. Why should the great wide universe be any different? You look at the study of dark matter and dark energy, you look at these maps that they've done where it shows the dark matter hairs literally coming off in little strings off of the planet Earth. There is the idea of currents, the idea of jet streams, of the way the winds work and the way the ocean's currents work on this planet. I promise you that we will be finding similar space phenomena, similar phenomena in the wider universe that we will be able to latch onto, that we will be able to carry us to the planets of the future. People keep thinking we're going to have to discard, we're going to have to build some special hyperdrive or warp gates or all this crazy sci-fi stuff. In my mind, we're not going to have to do all that work. Maybe we will down the road, but when we first start out, we will be following the currents of space. We will be following a path that's already been laid for us. I really do believe that, and the idea that we're going to have to do a lot of work to do that, I don't think we will. I think there's a big discovery waiting for us to have happen, and I feel like we're so close. You keep reading about, I don't know if you've heard all the discoveries they make about gravitational waves, right? Black holes spinning against you, and you literally see the ripple of space-time, right? The nature of space is not a vacuum, right? It's full of stuff. And there are currents out there that we're going to be able to take advantage of, just like we did 500 years ago.
In many ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And now, I know we're going to be running out of time, so
Sure.
Just to wrap up quickly, where can we learn more about you? Do you have a website or
Sure.
Facebook?
Yeah, I'm going to jog my memory of the Facebook link in a second here. The website is ocean-black.com.
Ocean-black.com.
Yeah, and that is, I put all kinds of content up there, planets, descriptions, histories. That's where the blog is. You can buy the book there. Both copies, both this copy and the short story that I just did, The Longest Raid of the Covenant. They're both also on Amazon. And then the Facebook, I believe, is facebook.com/oceanblackblog. But again, if you go to the main site, ocean-black.com, you'll find everything there.
Ocean-black.com. Excellent. Thank you very much, EJ. I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Again, this has been the Cape Cod Writers Center's Books of the World. I'm Paul Reynolds. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.